yeah. First respondents, but attacked. Those who are studying to be health professionals, also not spared. Yeah. Now, Lemkin gets to coin the term genocide, but what he describes was not happening for the first time. Anyone wants to talk about places where this had happened or had been happening before World War II? The Americas? You were going to say? Congo?
Namibia.
Ireland? New Zealand? Namibia?
In that sense, India as well, because 1942 we had the Great Bengal famine in India, and where the resources and the food grains were systematically sectioned off to the European soldiers who were fighting in the east against Japan. This was deliberately, this was a part of a proper pogrom, so to say, where people, so many people were lost their lives.
Yeah. So there's a colleague of ours at the University of Cape Town, a sociologist, political science scholar. His name is Lwazi Lushaba, Dr. Lwazi Lushaba. He was also a participant at the first decolonial summer school that Ramon and Nelson were part of curating in 2013. And years later, he gives a lecture at my university. This could have been 2018, where the provocation is Hitler did nothing wrong. Yeah, around COVID 2020. There was nothing wrong in what Hitler did. So that's the thing that got splashed out, and a call for him to be disciplined and dismissed. What then happened, because the lecture was recorded, is that it was posted on YouTube. It became the most listened to lecture probably in the history of the University of Cape Town, if not for the whole of South Africa. And the person, I think student who made this lecture available wanted the context to be out there. The context to saying Hitler did nothing wrong. And it becomes clear that this that was announced by a Jewish student, probably Zionist, in order for Lwazi to be dealt with, was taken out of context for a reason. Because in Lwazi's lecture, he was making the point that the discipline of sociology did not have the tools to have served Europeans well, such that the Holocaust would not have happened. So basically, if sociology had done what sociology needed to do, the legal discipline law would have followed. And, the intelligentsia, the academy would have probably prevented what happened there. And then he says as well, it would not have had to wait until the chickens came home to roost, because those academics, including sociologists, political scientists, would have picked up what Germany was doing on their behalf everywhere else, including Namibia, where Hereros, the Namas faced exactly the same thing. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind, that Lemkin gets to coin a term when the practice had been going on for very long. Yes?
Important is that we at that time was the colony of the Germans.
Yes.
And that the extermination of the Herero was led by, Himmler was the general, the chief commander of the SS leader in the extermination of people, Jewish, black people, etc. And his father was in charge of the extermination. And he was there with his father in that process of extermination. So this confirms the necessary point that Hitler was using colonial methods now applied to other groups.
Oh, yeah.
A necessary point that, that fact, the methods, Europeans, what the Europeans have been doing, the rest of the humanity, now you have someone doing it to other Europeans.
Yeah.
And then Hitler becomes like demonized.
Yeah.
Now, if Hitler would have continued doing what the other were doing, Hitler is in the colonies. Then Hitler won't have been a problem or won't have been because he will be killing non-Western colonies.
Yeah. You wanted to add? I also want to thank the names sometimes, you can't quite match with the person sometimes. I mean, she'll get there. There's someone who reminded us about the need to protect ourselves, the value of protection tools as we engage on these kinds of topics that trigger us because we can relate. And I want to ask if there's been any remembering of wisdoms, that help us heal as we confront empire. Before I put Nali on the spot. Okay, go ahead, Nalia.
Something I remembered as a result of the lecture yesterday was when we were practicing how to breathe. I remembered in my community we have people that work with bones in our bodies, and with bones, they're called hueseros. It's not just the bones though, it's everything, the tendons. And I went to see a huesero in my community in El Salvador, and he told me I was carrying a lot of stress in a few different places. But one important place that I remembered yesterday was here in my hands. Here, and you can I remembered as we were thinking about where we carry stress and energies. And I started to massage my hand right there, and instantly I could feel my jaw starting to unclench. But I had forgot, even though it was something I was recently told in January, I had completely forgot, and I didn't remember until yesterday.
Anyone who can relate with this work? Yeah. It's interesting how that has traveled around the globe, because I also could relate. And I couldn't remember who had taught me, but the value of doing this when the body is asking for it and where that knowledge actually resides. And how you're not going to read about this in a textbook. So just as a reminder, the 3 seminars I'm presenting are about outlining genocide. Did Ruthie take all her markers at the point of colonial? Okay, thank you. Encounter. Sorry. Yeah, from a geopolitical and historicized global health perspective. So that's the broad topic, right? And I spoke about the 5 propositions. We unpacked the first one yesterday. So today we're moving to the second one, the longish proposition, given the global superiority, inferiority, hierarchy along the line of the human that is sustained by the racist, capitalist, you know the rest. The genocide, institutions. The genocide that ensues is selective. So we'll deal with this one, and then the third one, which is the markers for selective genocide manifest through unmanageable, chronic population ill health. Okay, so we're going to deal with the two propositions today. Now, to help us think about these institutions that sustain this inferiority-superiority hierarchy along the line of the human, I'm going to share some slides. So, Abraham. Won't surprise you, because you've heard this before, many of you, you've seen this before. Okay. Sure. Is it going to show? Okay. There, okay. Looks familiar? So this is Fanon's work with contributions from many, including Ramon, and my partner in crime, Frank, likes visualizing things, and he's helped put this together. And you can see what's happening above the line of the human and below the line of the human. So above the line, humanity is recognized, and below, not recognized. You have white privilege mitigating oppressions of other kinds, and racial oppression aggravating all other oppressions below the line. In terms of materiality of domination, above the line you have regulation and emancipation, and below the line you have materiality of domination manifesting through violence and dispossession. Now, it helps sometimes to think of concrete examples, because there are people who get quite distressed by this, in that, you know, it seems to lock us in. And sometimes begin to disbelieve that it is indeed so. And there's an example from South Africa, which I know that my fellow country people will recognize, but some of you might have heard of this. So above the line, you have this person standing on top of a police vehicle, the South African police. I mean, I can't think of a stronger representation on who is even above the state in my country. What had happened was that there was murder involving farm workers who are Black, and the person implicated in this murder was a white Afrikaner. You've heard of white Afrikaners? Apparently, there's genocide against them. Yes, yes. Any takers beyond America. So they had a protest when this person was incarcerated. It may have been more than one. And they go to the court to protest. And this is what happens. They topple the vehicle, and one man stands on top of the vehicle. Below the line of the human, you have the Marikana massacre. These are mine workers who had gone on a protracted, unprotected strike for higher wages. And among them were those that work with the rock face below the earth, using very heavy and dangerous machinery. And all they were asking for was a raise in their salary, in their wages. And the state responded in the way that you see here. What happened was brutal, in that many of them had gunshots at the back. And before this happened, they were surrounded with barbed wire. So when we talk about violence, and when we talk about premature death and hyperhumanization, this example, for me, makes it very difficult to think any differently about what the line of the human and the superiority, inferiority hierarchy looks like. What we have also, some of us have found very useful, and this is, again, with the resurgence of the decolonial discourse that was sparked by Rose Must Fall in South Africa, was this offering from Ramon, which is a definition of racism. For a long time, in South Africa at least, we couldn't quite find ways to define racism in a way that resonated. And we fell into that trap where it is reduced to relational matters. And for Black people in general, if you were to use Steve Biko's construction of blackness, where he forced us to think about people who are subjugated in ways that are stratified. So if you're lighter skinned, if you're mixed race, you get treated a little bit better under apartheid, and if you're Black, you're the bottom. It became very difficult. So with the democratic government, which is majority Black in terms of my complexion, it became easier to say, for some, apartheid might have ended, but now we face a new apartheid. Colored people aren't Black enough. So the colored conception of racialized people in South Africa is problematic. There are those who subscribe to it and will hold on to dear life because it links to a better life that they experienced and what they hanker back to. But this definition became useful in that relational issues are seen as a manifestation at another level. But the issue here, again, being these institutions that are global, that are capitalist, patriarchal, Western-centric, Christian-centric, and are part of the modern colonial world system. So what it does, this definition, is that it politicizes racism by foregrounding unequal power relations involving a dehumanization dynamic. Yeah? So unequal power relations become the focus rather than difference in complexion. The definition also historicizes by recognizing the long history of racism. I mean, when we heard about the debate, Las Casas and Sepulveda, and we begin to track racism from that point. The definition also emphasizes the systemic nature of racism. Yeah. And lastly, although it includes pigmentation, it also goes beyond that. So that's as much as I want to say there. But there's also this visual that I found very useful to emphasize the systemic nature of racism. So the spider web. Again, my partner in crime becomes useful to depict by drawing from Abdullah and in the metaphor itself. So you really can start anywhere with this image. I find that sometimes I start at a place, but then I move the next time I look at it. You'll also find this in the article that was shared with you. So I'm going to start with the radius of the spider web, which I feel it depicts the structural arrangements in terms of the geopolitical reach from the center to the peripheral, determining who has the uncontested right to exist and to own, and therefore the absolute right to self-defense. Whew. So the 7th of October, is that the right to self-defense? Why is it so easy for some to not see it as the right to self-defense? And this begins to help us, in my view. Nelson also spoke about the right to freedom of speech. But there's also the right to academic freedom, which is reserved for some and not others. I don't know if you're familiar with Steve Salaita. When I was the chair of the Academic Freedom Committee at my university, I invited Steve Salaita to come talk about academic freedom. And this was at the time that he was yet unemployed in academia after he lost his job for posting something around how Zionism will have many of us anti-Semitic. I mean, this was how many years ago that he posted this, do you remember? 2014. It was almost as if it was a prophecy for where we are now. The Jerusalem definition of anti-Semitism versus the International Holocaust Remembrance version of anti-Semitism. Yeah? You can see there are those who are given the right to academic freedom, to freedom of speech, and the rest. And when you look at the center and along, and then you move along the radius, and and you think about the spaces in between as institutions, what I see are institutions, positions, in relative distance to the center. And the center need not be static in terms of who's there, because in my observation, there's a switch between multinational corporations and international alliances. They switch places. So sometimes it is the multinationals, and sometimes it's the international alliance institutions such as NATO, the EU, sometimes the UN. And you can already see if you go to the periphery and coming from the African continent, you may see the African Union, you can see ECOWAS, which is the West Africa Alliance, you see BRICS, and at the very periphery, you can see the Sahel States Alliance. Some of you are nodding because perhaps you're familiar with what's happening in the Sahel region and where some of us are hopeful. So you have Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger succeeding in doing something that is so refreshing. Coups without bloodshed, bloodless coups, and getting the French to pack. I mean, there's a lot there. We're watching, we're following very closely. But there's certainly, that alliance, the Sahel Alliance, is certainly not at the center. And we worry about what could happen, driven from the center, to dismantle those possibilities there. And then sometimes I think the English language is I don't know, maybe, but this umbrella-like circles, right? I think of them as different institutions intersecting and also what they help manifest. We can think here, for instance, around the prison industrial system and how that comes about through intersections of institutions, the pharmaceutical industrial system. So for instance, you have dumping of medicines in certain parts of the world. You have big food institutions in collusion to sustain big food. And then you have institutions in health. In the paper you have, I speak about co-option of institutions and professions as one form of institutions. Professions are interesting in that in their inception, often they are good intentions, right? But then in practice over time, you see something else. And often it's because they have been co-opted. In the article you've got on occupational consciousness, I cite the work of Pierre-Luc Tecourt and Dave Holmes. The article is titled "The Shadow Side of Occupational Therapy: Necropower, State Racism, and Colonization." where occupational therapy gets co-opted during Hitler's regime to do the work of the state, exercising necropower. Necropower, you will recall, is when you have sovereign powers that have the capacity to define who matters, who does not, who is disposable, and who is not. And that's the work of Achille Mbembe. And with the profession being co-opted to help the state decide in relation to people with disabilities. And they did exactly that. So you can see how co-option can happen. So this is how I thought to address this second proposition. In terms of how these institutions that are sustained lead us to selective genocide. Now I'm going to move to the next proposition, which is around the markers for genocide and how they manifest through unmanageable chronic population ill health. Nadia?
Can I ask a question? Would the spider then be the work within the system or the professionals?
Sure. I have not thought hard enough, long enough to have a clear answer around what the spider represents. But the spider web really just helps us sketch the structural arrangements. So institutions play a big part, and professions are just one example of institutions. When you have the media, you have the banks. I mean, if you think about banks, I would put the World Bank, the IMF at the center. Next, I'll put reserve banks, depending on ownership, starting with those that are owned by corporates and state-owned reserve banks at the periphery. When it comes to the media, you have mainstream media in the global north, CNN, the rest of them, the BBC. You have mainstream media in the global south, to the periphery, and you have social media to the up to a point, because sometimes we get censored even there. I mean, I got disciplined for things that I put on social media, right? So yeah, the spider web is where I am in my thinking, but maybe someone can think of what the spider represents. I don't know. Yes, Siwa?
I don't know. I think these are my thoughts, anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I find systems, institutions, sometimes to have living qualities. They act, they help people, they respond. These are human qualities or consciousness at some point. So I've been really convinced that racism is just a spirit that was a system. And I say that when I look at the spiders in your house, you don't notice them, but you know they're there. Racism at the University of Cape Town, other universities everywhere. Sometimes you can point at it, the occasional time when you see a spider, right? The spiders hide in plain sight. And sometimes you feel it and you can't point at it. It's just elusive. So when you complain, like it's difficult to even talk to your line manager. Someone said something that didn't have any racial slurs, but it was still racist. You know, like, or they just said a comment, if it was said by somebody else, it would be completely harmless. But there are these unspoken, implicit communications that we always we're talking or speak at. So I think the spider, if you think about it, creates a nest, it comes out of it, that's the way. And racism, the common theme across all what you have presented, right? Using that Ramon's definition. And because the word comes out of the spider, the institutions follow the logic of the spider, in this case, the logic of racism. I mean, if you think about genocide, I think, is also an entity that can overwhelm an entire nation, do what it is doing to another nation. And I'm using that because it's a different cosmology. Everywhere else I've spoken or chatted with people, they wouldn't consider racism active and alive in the same sense that we are. That finds expressions in people, sometimes organized groups of people.
Yeah, I think it's helpful in that, you know, I know there are times when I refuse to take my mind somewhere because I'm thinking, I don't know if we are ready. So you're forcing me to go there, you know, and I can only think of a spider as a cosmology. And I really, I'm saying this given what I have learned over time from indigenous people, and I'm going to be going there soon, in how everywhere I go and I engage with indigenous groupings, there's something common amongst us. So think of that and think of the cosmology behind the colonial logics of death. Whatever inspires that, I don't want to name it, but I know that that's something those of us who identify with indigeneity in one way or another know that is anti-human, and we refuse to be reduced to that. I mean, I often encounter people who say, but why do these people not fight back? You know, there's more of you in South Africa at least. How could you allow a few to subjugate you for this long? And part of it is this refusal to be them and have a long game. And the Sahel region is showing us the possible. I keep saying to people, you know, there's something that I'm seeing there that I've been praying for and hoping for. And it was lovely to see it unfold. You know, military might is one thing, but there's a spirituality. There's definitely a spirituality that unfolded in those regions. Hence, a coup without bloodshed. And women were involved, or those that at least look like, you know, self-identify as women. I'm sure there was involvement of everyone outside of binaries. But what I observed were people wearing dresses, long dresses, because of the Islamic presence in the Sahel region, especially, Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traore, and how he openly claims his Islamic roots. And those individuals who are linked to the kitchen, what they were doing. And you wouldn't have seen this on mainstream media, so I forgive you if you don't know what I'm talking about. It just was hidden from you. Brooms to sweep the French flag away. Yeah, how are you going to fight against that? So by the time the French ambassador had to go, I knew, there was just no way. Macron had said, no, you stay put. I'm like, no, you're going, bro. And your currency and your language are to follow. So the cosmology represented in the spider web, in the spider, is that other thing. The one time that I came close to saying, whew, I can understand how we don't want to be like them, is when a professor, and actually when I spoke yesterday about this person that we knew who became a professor after getting a PhD in no time, a professor in philosophy, he is known, well, his claim to fame is this book. Well, let's start with his philosophy. We should never have been born. Anti-natalism is his. That's his contribution to the world. Yes, celebrated. Hence made professor very quickly. David Benatar. And when I was advising the Vice Chancellor to respond meaningfully to what Rose Masfall were asking for, he was one of those on the other side, trying to fight everything that we're trying to do. I remember when he came back from sabbatical because the statue was removed in his absence, he was in Sebe, came back to Senate and he apologized for having been on sabbatical. So basically saying, if I were here, the statue would still be here. Yeah? And I was fascinated by how some students would say, including Black students, that is a wonderful teacher, very, I kept thinking, interesting. Oh, well, because he knows everyone's names. Yeah. But I also realized that there's a reason why there's not been PhDs coming out of our philosophy department. Why aren't you building the postgraduate program in philosophy at the so-called top university in Africa? And what we picked up was hectic. So it's a majority Black country. You have a philosophy department. You want to keep it a certain way. You're the head of department. So undergraduate teaching means that you have these young brains, young minds, young bodies that you talk down to. And you repeat. Yet, you can do this for 30 years. I kept thinking of that song, Watch Me Whip, Watch Me Nay Nay. And guess what? You can't miss his lectures. So for students, facing any health crisis, whatever, you're in trouble because you attend everything. Yeah? But the other thing that was happening was that if your intellect shows up, you get targeted if you're not white. And these are the students who in third year will be slapped with a plagiarism allegation. An essay is kept, and only when you're in third year, you slept with it. And like a plagiarism case for an undergrad, it is a pedagogic issue. Really? And why only Black students? And I realized what it was about. In third year, that's when you are thinking of doing your honors. So if your whole year is taken up fighting this plagiarism case, your grades are going to fall. And that was the intention. So you can't compete. Your grades are not competitive to go into honors. And meanwhile, white students who do their honors, do very well, get sent overseas to do their masters and their PhDs because there's a network. I mean, this is a discipline, an institution, which managed to keep Black thought out. There's a cosmology. There's a cosmology, and it's anti-human. Now, thank you for that question. I really, I couldn't think of where it was going to take us, but that's where we are. Now, let's move to the third proposition, which is markers for selective genocide manifest through unmanageable chronic population ill health. And you know this, indigenous people worldwide experience a disproportionately high burden of chronic diseases compared to non-indigenous populations. The stats are there. But there's a controversy with this term, indigenous, right? But there's a controversy around names we call ourselves as of this complexion and shades of it. And you remember the first technology of genocide by Lemkin, political, naming, changing names. So the right to name who you are as a collective is an issue. And many who are regarded indigenous did not say they were indigenous. It's not them that said we are indigenous. So it's the corresponding term is native, which in South Africa was used. Natives versus white people who could vote. Yeah. But there's also the diaspora. There's people who were either enslaved, people who left for whatever reason, who have a connection with their places of origin. So there's that controversy as well. In a book that I contributed a chapter to, that's the title. It's just recently been published. These are scholars around the world who write on anti-colonial research methodologies. We were invited, Yeketseng, Ned, Gubelamji, and myself, to share some thought and around indigenous knowledge systems and drawing primarily from someone called Chilisa. And we had to grapple with that controversy around indigeneity and think about ways to frame what we mean by indigenous people. And we came to this understanding that it's really people with varying degrees of dispossession. And this is sometimes what can be used to divide us. Oh, but you're not like them, so you can't be indigenous. We've all faced some kind of dispossession in varying degrees, and there are examples of this around land, how much of our past we remember or we don't remember, disconnection to our languages. You know, in one way, there could be linguicide, so a complete disappearance of these languages, or what Ngugi wa Thiong'o says, calls linguifam. So it's a famine, but not a side in terms of the languages that people spoke. But we also have, I've spoken about these identities that are imposed on us, that we didn't choose for ourselves. And who's doing the naming? Humans are indigenous to somewhere, right? But isn't it interesting that you have white people who do not necessarily claim indigeneity, especially if they're part of the settler population. And some keep the passports linked to dual passports are a thing in South Africa. In Zimbabwe, it's very interesting. There's something that I find absolutely fascinating in that Black Zimbabweans in South Africa are refugees, immigrants. But we have white Zimbabweans who now live in South Africa and are citizens. Yes. And the question is, how did that happen? And the Afrikaners, who we now call Amerikaners, are a particular species, really, because they really are. We're trying to make sense of what's happening there, the contradictions and the lies. Because this naming of self as a collective, as Afrikaner, is a direct translation of African. So this adoption of names, when you think about Palestine and you think of who's a Jew, who's not a Jew, it gives you pointers to the logical conclusion, what may be the intention here. So just think of it. If there were successes of complete genocide in South Africa of Black people, and we were left with Afrikaners, who will remember who the Africans were? It's got to a point at which Afrikaners even claim that their language is African. If you've ever listened to Afrikaans spoken by educated Afrikaners, it's as Flemish, it's as Dutch as it can get. And those who speak a version of Afrikaans that is not polished enough, that is a mixture of Malay, some African terms, doesn't count. So we've had to fight for different versions of Afrikaans spoken by people who are not white. I mean, if you think of those who are of mixed heritage, Malay, African, the colonizers, and sometimes through rape, and what they speak being completely pushed aside. And Afrikaans, which is spoken by a select few, is the one that counts. It's absurd. But this is the controversy we have to live with. Yeah. I want to talk about this chronic population ill health, and just maybe begin to have the conversation with you around what you are aware of in terms of the kinds of diseases we're talking about. In the only stats that I can bring to the surface involves Maori. And in terms of heart attacks, ischemic heart attacks, twice. In terms of stats compared to non-Maori. Diabetes, 1.5 times more likely than non-Maori. Seeing Neve, Sarah, you nodding. Do you want to add to this? Yeah? Any other groupings? Go ahead, and then in.
Because of the legacy of colonialism, and the famines that we've experienced, as a result, our body has adapted to retaining levels of fat. We've gone through so many periods of famine, biomechanism of this. As a result, people from South Asian background are high risk of diabetes, heart attack, high blood pressure, everything. There's been studies to prove that you want to mention how Bengal famine, for example, estimate lower end was 2 million Bengalis were killed when they could be the food supply was from Bengal that went to the supply the troops. And Churchill specifically was highlighted to Churchill that Bengalis are dying. And one of many responses was that if they're dying, then why are they breeding out rats? And he referenced, he also said that if they're dying, why is it army then yet?
Yeah,
Wow.
Those famines, and the issue is that early on we spoke about colonists. When the British came to our region, they completely disregarded the way we cultivated the land. So Bengal, for example, is a delta, and as the land itself, it's below sea level. The reason why it normally doesn't get flooded is because the Himalayas, the water from the Himalayas comes down at phase and pushes down. But because the water from the nutrients that come from the Himalayas makes the Bengal region very fertile. So we have many seasons where we can actually cultivate whatever agriculture it is. When the British came, they completely messed up the system. So they start taxing us at a time when we couldn't do the produce from agriculture. But when the Mongols came, they realized that, if they were going to tax the indigenous population, they had to align it the right way. So up until the British, the Bengali calendar was aligned to the taxation system. And also, like, as everyone mentioned, how, like, when the crops were cultivated, a certain percentage was always kept behind, so that when the famine did happen naturally, there were reserves to give out to people who needed it. Arundhati Roy, not Arundhati Roy, Amartya Sen, who is a scholar of famine, he remembers in the Bengal region when a young child, when the Bengal famine was happening, he remembers that there were beggars coming at his doorstep, and in Bengali they would say, Penabab Pedro, which literally means the water that comes out from boiling rice, and I just drink that. They would say that, let me drink that. Why? So, like, as a result, Bengalis and amongst many others kind of groups within the South Asian subcontinent suffer from these diseases. But then in Jamaica, for example, hypertension is really high. Again, it's the way that colonizers colonize.
I mean, you're beginning to touch on the fourth proposition, right? That this chronic population ill health are unmanageable by design. Go
I
ahead.
was going to talk about the fabrication of ill health. Because, well, for one thing, like you said, the Bengali family was completely, essentially constructed, right? And the family was the same, it was completely constructed. But I was thinking about the indigenous populations in the United States have generally got very poor health outcomes. So there's an example that we were discussing yesterday, which is who got the masks during COVID,
Yeah.
right? So
Sure, yeah. As a scientist working in a institution, so colonial roots in the US context. By April 2020, the college had managed to spend up to billions of dollars and obtained protective gear. So where anyone was affiliated can have free access to KN95s. April 2020.
But it took until at least the end of 2021 before the non-affiliation passed. And I know this because I was supporting a network of volunteers who were selling fabric masks to non-affiliation.
They couldn't get,
And all of them were women of color.
Yeah. Also, just before I forget, can we take this up? So some scholars to read on the term indigenous and how we reclaim the names we want to call ourselves. I'm just going to write a few names. Trying to write somewhere where you can see, because if I go all the way, you're not going to see. All right, so Ladislaus Semali, they write with someone called Jewel Pinchelwe. And of course, I'm sure you will know Linda Tuhiwai, Linda Smith. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
I was going to maybe you. Professor Mongai-Marios's work on disease, so I'm answering your question, on diseases of heart. And in South Africa, tuberculosis affects disproportionately Black people, as well as HIV/AIDS. And Professor Marios's work is massive heart disease. Saying that this is a very preventable test, and yet many people die from it. And his conclusions sustain the high infection level. We are known globally for Cape Town being the most. We have the most number of people with TB in Cape Town. And Cape Town is very wet. So that TB and HIV have worked together and we have a very high prevalence of that. And I mentioned that Cape Town is very because many people live in townships. Townships in America are shanty towns, but these are corrugated iron structures. What you don't get is a roof that has walls. So TB is an opportunistic then because of the condition that they find themselves in.
So I've added the fourth proposition because we've moved there. So tomorrow we'll do the last one because we've covered it.
Can I also add
Yes.
something? So this is something which I've learned about recently after I moved to Denmark. I learned more about the colonial entanglements of Denmark and Greenland after I moved here, and this is what I was so horrified to read, that so there are these injections that are given to control fertility, Depo-Provera, and I remember reading about them, back in India and how they were used to control the fertility of poor women specifically because India was also, made to believe that their real problem lies in population, overpopulation, so on and so forth. And but then moving on to Denmark, so then these girls as young as 12 and 11 were injected with Depo-Provera to control, so that they could not conceive at all. So and also they had these IUD devices implanted. So basically controlling the population of Greenland.
Yeah.
So that, and this was so horrific because this came to light because one of the ministers, political leaders from Greenland, is part of the Danish parliament, and she raised this concern that how she was injected with this injection, and then the mainstream Danish media made fun of her, saying that why is she making such a hue and cry about it? The ill effects or the whatever the consequences of the injection fade out in a year. So why is she, making a fuss about it? And it was then that the story begins, and I learned about how young girls who have not even hit puberty were given these injections that deliberately control their population. And this is something which now I can understand, after we have looked at ways in which genocide is. So Denmark is amongst those Nordic nations that considers itself as the benevolent colonialist. So there is also this joke about it. So I'm a cool colonialist. So exactly, and that is how these memes, Greenlanders have made these memes about Danish. And it becomes so important to realize and also make people who are working on decoloniality in Denmark understand that this is, so I can still feel that resistance. So whatever little work I've been able to do in Denmark, I have seen that little resistance that we were better off. We were not as brutal as the Germans were or the French were or the British were. But then that doesn't discount, you and what you did to people in Greenland or the Faroe Islands or Ghana also for that matter.
Yeah, sure.
They tend to compare, yes. Yes.
And I really would encourage you to look up health and well-being stats affecting indigenous populations. I mean, New Zealand really keeps track. It's interesting that you can find reports.
Yeah. For now, you can find.
Get in one, you can.
That, like a month ago, they.
Wow.
That was not a survey-based population.
Yeah, because it's an indictment, isn't it? Canada also. You can find stats, at least for now. No one is from Canada here. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed the first part.
Yeah, so just the accessibility to the data that tells us how indigenous populations around the world are doing. Mm. Mm.
Of course. Couple,
Yeah, yeah, and then I'll come to you.
I remember I was attending for a meeting, and there was one person that was complaining about the First Nation people who are alcoholics. And so it kind of like disturbed me a bit. So it doesn't make sense. Like the alcoholics and why so. So when I looked into it, whilst I wasn't able to take up the data for the Canadian population. But what I did realize that I referenced the book earlier on, Transcolonial and Psychology of Oppression. We talked about in that book where the colonizers would deliberately get indigenous people hooked on alcohol to the point that Island of Manhattan was sold by the indigenous population for 3 hours of rum. 3,000 rum was possible for that island. And so like if First Indigenous people or First Nations in Canada who are alcoholics or if Aborigines in Australia, if they are alcoholics, they explain why. It was a very deliberate attempt to create through alcohol.
Ingrid?
Yeah, just an example from the education systems in South Africa, when I was looking at statistics for school uniform sizes, racialized across the population, expectations, I suppose this is a manifestation of economic ill health and poverty, not necessarily the stuntedness, the expectations by a racial group of science children are usually based on school is a horrific evidence of the effects of poverty and also food expectation, which during apartheid was racialized in such a clear way. And another way to see that is the food in Robben Island, where Mandela and others were racialized, and at Constitution Hill, in the prison systems, the racialized expectations of nutrition are also there.
Tracking chronic population ill health is important at national level because it's the mirror. It tells you what's going on. And often the tendency is to pretend it's not happening. So if you come from a place where these stats are being kept, it's a good starting point. Because it becomes very difficult to address that which is being hidden. It gets worse. It only gets worse. I've tried to find the most reliable sources in terms of what happened in Patagonia. But what I've been told is that the indigenous populations that exist in artwork no longer in life. I mean, imagine that, where you have entire generations wiped out, such that you don't see them around, you can't find them. They exist in artwork. We spoke about the prison industrial system, right? And I'm sure we think of this as incarceration behind walls, but they're open air prisoners. And oftentimes, the telltale signs in terms of debility will be the conditions. Before what's happening now in Gaza got to this level, we were picking up the level of debility manifesting in chronic ill health, TB. And the question is, has it always been the case that people in Gaza and the West Bank had TB? No, it wasn't. And the crazy thing is that the resurgence of tuberculosis rose so much that compared to everywhere else in the world, it became interesting for some scientists to do their research there. You were going to say something? No. Yeah. So tracking chronic population ill health is very important. What we said earlier about what happened in Germany with the Holocaust and saying it was happening elsewhere can also happen to much of humanity if we ignore what has been happening to indigenous populations over time. It's almost like it's an experiment. And then it gets spread everywhere.
In addition to the chronic illness too, that not only not looking at it, but giving it other names or changing it. Like for instance, there has been a debate, a study about how adverse childhood experiences do produce chronic illness, or they give the highest percentage of different types of chronic illness, like health consequences of having lived adverse childhood experiences. But those, and this is a very US term, but those were very much circumscribed to abuse in family, very much linked to family abuse, to structured family relationships, or having parents that were addicted to something. So kind of putting so much labels and stigmatization over the family of this child, where this child grew up. So it's about, but it's very linked to that. So then it's also labeling where it happens. It's been very recently where these adverse childhood experiences, when it is in the mental health science, is added that it's any type of violence too.
Absolutely.
Not only but it has been in science, it was not recognized. It's about, okay, you've been living a hell during childhood on racism, but this is not accounted as an adverse childhood experience by science, because or you've been sexually abused, or your parents were there was neglect, but not on the social and what you were witnessing. So now slowly, there are more terminologies on colonial trauma, and which is added to. It's still very hard for people to include it.
So how do we look? So you're helping me revisit what I had said earlier, that we've covered this, we won't go there tomorrow. So we will actually unpack further here, because discourses on social determinants of health, there are smokes and mirrors there. And we'll start there tomorrow to unpack how it happens that we are steered to look there and name things a particular way so that we don't look this side. Is there anything else to be said? Go ahead, Rishi.
I was thinking tomorrow if you were to touch on mental health manifestations as well.
Ah, okay.
And also you could speak about medical complicity.
Oh, yeah.
The role of the medical
Yes.
access.
Yes. So to the last proposition is diagnosis and treatment as colonial tools for genocide. Yeah. But in terms of mental health and chronic population ill health, the one example in South Africa is around alcohol spectrum disorder, fetal alcohol syndrome, sorry. Yeah, I mixed the two because it's fascinating, because there's ASD, there's fetal alcohol syndrome, and sometimes one gets diagnosed this way, the other that way, but sometimes there are convergent points. A couple of years ago, I got a distress call from a sister from the US. Came from USC, part of a big research grant. Also an occupational therapist and steeped in neuroscience, and works with a number of neuroscientists and psychiatrists, so mental health. And in South Africa, there's this system where you get ranked as a scientist and their levels. So an A-rated scientist is walking on water. And one of the collaborators from my university was part of this team. This sister, trying to remember her first name, it will come. She tracks me through another colleague, and she says, I have to see you, and I have to see you now. I got your number, and I need to see you. So we meet, and she tells me what I've witnessed. I don't know how to deal with, but I can't continue. So I asked, what is it? I says, red flags. She says, I'm seeing red flags. This is a longitudinal study, with lots and lots and lots of funding over time. And she had been working with this scientist, with this team for years. But she had never come to South Africa to be part of the field work. This was the first time. So she said the first alarm bell was on the first day after arrival. A car, combi van arrived, and the announcement was, we're taking you to the field. It's like a longitudinal study? You're taking us to a field? I mean, that's not how it works when you're studying population health. You know, right? The sample, it can't be located in one place. You're sampling the whole population. So, what is the research population if the sample is in one place? And then they get taken to this place where generation after generation after generation have lived with fetal alcohol syndrome, a phenomenon that continues. And this is the longitudinal study. Do you see where it's going? A lab has been created, a living lab. And she says it's unethical. We can't research a people generation after generation where the phenomenon doesn't go away. Where's the responsibility for us as health researchers to raise the red flag and say there's something going on here? And linked to what you were saying about food and your sizes of uniform. I mean, I'm not sure if you've ever seen or experienced children with fetal alcohol syndrome. So when you go to a place and you see many of them, I mean, you can't walk away. I mean, it's something that will haunt you. Because they have morphological features as well, and they have behavioral issues. And these behavioral issues make these children very susceptible to be co-opted into gangs. And because they are tiny, they can move into spaces to do things that gangs want done. And you are calling yourselves researchers in health, and you get to be an A-rated scientist on the back of this? So we had to strategize how she exits, raises the alarm bell, and survives it. Of course she didn't, as much as we tried. So you can imagine, when tenure became a possibility, it wasn't going to be her. She had to move to another space, because doing that is career suicide. But she couldn't live with herself, having witnessed this. This is in South Africa. And the population where this is happening, the Western Cape, is known for its best wines. Wine produced from farms where generation after generation, instead of wage, people were given alcohol. So how do you blame parenting skills? That's your point. If only they knew how to raise their children, but you have this carnage, generation after generation after generation. Should we leave it there? We'll pick up tomorrow on the discourses that allow this thing to happen, where you must look the other way. Okay, thank you.